Loved You Better Than You Knew by Mrs. McVeigh Miller. Copyright 1897.
Chapter 35. Cynthia's Betrothal. Arthur Varian was roused at midnight by the reception of a startling telegram from his mother. Everard Dawn fatally injured in a railway accident here. Come at once and bring Cinthia. He staggered to a chair, groaning aloud. So this is the sorrowful end. Conquering an onrushing flood of painful emotion, he sought Frederick Foster and imparted the sad news. Heavens! How shocking! And I had only a few hours ago written to ask him for his daughter's hand, exclaimed the young man. Then Cinthia has accepted you, Arthur cried with emotion. Yes, only yesterday, and I intended to tell her tomorrow. Can you wish me joy, old fellow? Inquired Fred Foster anxiously, for his cousin had made him acquainted with all his sad past story, and he felt the keenest sympathy with his unhappiness. Arthur held out a cordial hand. It is good news to me, under the circumstances. May you both be very happy, he exclaimed generously. Thank you, Arthur. I will do my part toward it, returned the young man in a hopeful tone, adding, We had better go at once to Lodge Delight for Cinthia. I will go with you to Virginia, and no doubt Madame Ray will give us the comfort of her company. I shall beg her to do so, said Arthur. I am sure she will not refuse, for my mother would be perhaps but a poor consoler in the hour of grief. Indeed, I am puzzled to know how she and Mr. Dawn ever happened to be together at Charlottesville, for they have always avoided each other. But the mystery cannot be solved until we reach her side. Making the most hasty preparations possible for leaving, they set out for Lodge Delight, having first sent a telegram to Mrs. Varian at Charlottesville, assuring her that they would start at once. So expeditious were their movements that before daylight the four were on the train speeding to Virginia, Madame Ray having gladly acceded to their request for her company. Of course I would not permit Cinthia to go alone to so sad a scene as her father's deathbed, poor dear, she said with warm sympathy. Cinthia was shocked and grieved at the news of Everard Dawn's accident and impending death, but her grief lacked the depth of a filial bereavement. Owing to her strong resentment at his own coldness, the girl had never felt the sentiment of love for him. If Madame Ray had died, she would have been inconsolable, but in the case of her father she felt quite differently. She was shocked and pained, but she would have felt almost as deeply over any well-known friend who had met with such an accident. His death would not mean any serious affliction to her. Indeed, when the first shock was over, she remembered that perhaps now she would never have to leave dear Madame Ray for another home. True, in a moment of madness and resentment at Arthur's coldness, she had rashly consented to marry his cousin, but she was not at all certain that she would keep her promise. She had told him frankly that she admired and esteemed him but had no love to give. If he was willing to wait, to give her time to cultivate a warmer feeling, she would try her best to learn, and on these terms he based their betrothal. To Cinthia herself it seemed as if she must surely grow fond of him in time. He was so handsome, so splendid, so devoted. She argued to herself that in time her love for Arthur must surely be overcome by her contempt for his weakness and cowardice that had brought sorrow into both their lives. Yet, as she watched his pale and sorrowful face while the train sped on its way, she felt a rush of painful tenderness flooding her heart, while she wondered why he was taking so much to heart the trouble that had fallen on herself. Everard Dawn was nothing to him. Nothing except a man he had cause to dislike, because he had prevented his marriage to his daughter. Yet his pallor, his sadness, his preoccupation were effects that might have been produced by the death of a near relative. Cinthia, drooping in her seat, with a thick veil drawn over her pallid face, could not keep her eyes from her old love, could not repress the rush of tenderness that made her heart ache. She would have liked, the promised bride of Frederick Foster, to have thrown her arms about Arthur Varian's neck, pressed her pale cheek to his, and whispered in the passion of her womanly love, "Why are you so pale, so sad, my best beloved? Is it for me? Has Frederick told you that I have promised to marry him, and are you grieved? Perhaps the old love is not dead yet in your heart. Perhaps it cries for me in the dead of night as my heart for you. Oh, is it too late to go back, to thrust aside everything but the imperious demands of our love, and be happy yet?" A sudden wild thought yet came to her, and made her heart leap. "Only let me find my father alive, and he shall explain the mystery of his opposition to my marriage with Arthur. She too is there, Arthur's mother, who for the sake of her hatred of my father and mother was willing to wreck our happiness forever. Who knows but that when both are dead, both my mother and father, her cruel revenge may be satiated, so that she may be willing to let love have its way?" It would have startled Frederick Foster, who hovered near her with eager attentions, to find how little part he had in her thoughts and dreams, for a faint trembling hope had come to her heart that perhaps the death of her father might have some effect on her relations with Arthur, might possibly restore them to happiness. Arthur, meanwhile, knowing the futility of all hope in Cynthia's direction, gave himself up to unrestrained melancholy, in which blended considerable curiosity as to how it happened that his mother and Mr. Donne had been together at Charlottesville. Everard Donne, who had an aversion to letter-writing, corresponded but infrequently with his daughter, hence had left her in ignorance of the date of his return from California. Mrs. Varian, on the other hand, had not apprised her son of her suddenly decided upon journey to Florida, so he could only nurse his wonder and melancholy together while looking back in a painful retrospection over the tangled web of what had been and what might have been, those saddest of all sad words. There was a silent prayer in his heart, too, that Everard Donne might survive till he reached his bedside, so that some last words might be said between them, some news be told, and perhaps some deathbed revelations be made to Cinthia. Chapter 36. An Obstinate Woman. Janetta, the indiscreet maid, would never forget the night when she blurted out the news of the railway wreck to her ailing mistress, and sent her into that long, deathly swoon. Mrs. Varian was not in the habit of fainting, and it gave Janetta a terrible scare, especially when the usual simple remedies failed to revive the unconscious lady. Pale as a marble figure, her pallor heightened by the loosened tresses of raven hair, and the inky lashes lying heavily against her cheek, she lay among the pillows, and though Janetta tried frantically first one thing and then another, no breath stirred the pulseless bosom of her mistress. She ran downstairs for a doctor, but every medico in the neighborhood had been summoned to the relief of the victims of the wreck. She could get no assistance for an hour, except that of terrified women. Among them they succeeded in rousing her momentarily to a consciousness of the situation, but almost as soon as her dark eyes opened, she closed them again, murmuring mournfully, "Let me die." And the remembrance of her trouble sent her immediately off into another spell, almost as long as the first one. The frightened and sympathetic women helped Janetta with all their skill and knowledge, until in about half an hour they saw Mrs. Varian's breast heave faintly, and her eyelids flutter. "She's coming to again, thank the Lord!" sobbed Janetta. "Now one of you women step in the next room and ask that doctor in there, trying to bring a dead man to life, to come in here and help us. And if he won't come, to send me word how to stop her from going off again as soon as she opens her eyes and remembers." The housemaid went, and the housekeeper said, "The man looked dead to me, but that doctor thought it might be temporary unconsciousness, and won't leave off trying to save him till he's sure. But, law, his leg was broke and there's a cut on the head. Concussion of the brain, maybe, so the doctor said. It's a pity for the poor man. He was a beauty of a fellow." "Wonder who he was," observed another, while Mrs. Varian's breathing grew more pronounced, and her dark eyes opened eagerly, as the housekeeper replied, "His sister was with him, an old lady that didn't get hurt at all, though her servant did. She said his name was Donne." There was a faint, strangled gasp from the bed, and at that moment the physician entered the room. "Oh, doctor, that poor man, did he ever come to?" eagerly inquired one of the women. He answered in his quiet, professional tone, "Yes, he recovered consciousness 10 minutes ago, but I almost fear I had as well have let him go without disturbing his peace. He is more than likely fatally injured." Then he turned his attention to the patient, almost starting in alarm at the preternaturally solemn look of the great, wide-open dark eyes. But if he had but known it, his first words had been more potent than medicine in aiding her recovery. "You have received a great shock, and I must immediately quiet your nerves," he said, as his cool, steady fingers touched her pulse. "Bend lower. I must speak to you," she murmured faintly. He stooped down, and she whispered, "Send away all but my maid." He looked around and repeated, "It is better for all these kind friends to withdraw now, as my patient will need absolute quiet. Her maid, of course, will remain." They all stole away very quietly, and he began to prepare a soothing potion for his strangely beautiful patient. He was startled when she murmured, "Doctor, you may give me something to strengthen me, but I will not take an opiate." "But, my dear lady," he began, only to be interrupted by a feeble but resolute voice. "No buts, my dear doctor, for my maid here can tell you that no one ever disputes my will. I must be strengthened, I tell you, for in a few minutes I shall go into the next room to visit your fatally injured patient. He is an old friend of mine, and I shall get you to send a telegram for me summoning his relations to his deathbed." "His sister is here," he replied, pressing to her lips the strengthening draught she demanded. She swallowed it, sighed, and replied, "There are others, sir, a daughter for one, but, Janetta, bring pencil and paper and copy what I dictate." With wonderful strength and self-command for one recovering from such a seizure, she dictated the message that Arthur received the same night. "Doctor, can you have this sent at once?" she inquired. He replied dubiously, "I will do so as soon as possible, but the telegraph line is very busy. There are 7 victims." "Poor souls! This must go at once at any cost. Do you hear, doctor? Send it at once, if it costs a little fortune. They are so far away, his friends, and what if they come too late?" Her proud voice breaking. "I will do my best. And as for you, madam, I advise you to rest quietly in your bed all night, or I will not answer for the consequences to your outraged nerves." "I tell you, sir, I will get up and go to that dying man at whatever cost to myself." "What an imperious woman," he thought, and answered aloud, "At least lie here until I send off the telegram and bring you news of my patient." "Tell me first, is there any immediate prospect of his death?" Shudderingly. "None that I could see. There is a fracture of the left leg and a cut on his head. Unless there are internal injuries, he might stand a bare chance, for recovery, but that long syncope was so alarming that I have scarcely any hope of saving him." "I will rest here till you return, doctor. Then I must go to him. I tell you no one shall prevent me. I knew him long ago. My duty is by his side now." He saw by her frantic obstinacy that there was more beneath the surface than her words revealed. To oppose her would be quite useless. So he said, assentingly, "It shall be as you wish, and perhaps his sister will be glad of your help. She is a feeble old woman, sadly shaken by the shock. But at least lie quiet till my return. Perfectly quiet, please." "I will," she replied, reluctantly enough, and when he was gone she turned toward Janetta, saying, "This wounded man, Mr. Dawn, was a dear friend of my youth, and for the sake of past days we must help his sister to nurse him till his daughter comes, or till he dies," shudderingly again. Janetta replied with secret amazement, "I will do my best, madam, and I have been counted a skilful nurse, but I think you are quite too ill to leave your room, at least till tomorrow." "I am stronger than you think. My willpower will help me through," replied the obstinate lady, and then she asked Janetta to dim the light and throw a gauze handkerchief over her face. Janetta obeyed, then lay down on a sofa to watch and wait for the doctor's return. She pretended to be asleep, thinking that this would suit her mistress best. Soon she heard low, stifled sobs from beneath the tiny handkerchief, and guessed that an hysterical mood had followed on Mrs. Varian's startling illness and agitation. It was remarkable for Mrs. Varian, the proud, the cold, the imperious woman, but Janetta knew it was best to take no notice and attempt no soothing. The icy crust of years was broken up at last, and tears must have their way. They were the greatest panacea for hidden grief. But the alert maid said to herself, "Such grief is not for an old friend simply. Doubtless he was once her lover. Then estrangement followed and broke their vows. I remember now that she became ill on the train at the sight of him and abruptly changed her mind, getting off here to spend the night. Well, the Lord's hand was in it, for he might have been killed had we stayed on the train," she concluded, without stopping to ask herself why she and Mrs. Varian should have been of so much more value to the world than others, that he should have taken special care to save their lives. It touched her deeply to hear that stifled sobbing, and she longed to speak some comforting words, but she knew it was not best, but lay still till the passion exhausted itself, and Mrs. Varian was passive once more, awaiting the doctor's return. It was an hour before he returned and said, "I have succeeded in sending off the telegram, and I find Mr. Dawn in a comatose state from which nothing perhaps can rouse him till tomorrow. It would be quite useless your going to him." "Yet, doctor, I must look upon his face tonight." And she raised herself in bed, throwing out beseeching hands. "I will wait then in the corridor for you and your maid," he replied, withdrawing. Janetta quickly attired her mistress in a comfortable robe, and gathered her dark, streaming tresses into a loose knot. Giving her the support of her arm, she led her out to the old doctor, who quickly came forward to meet them. "I have just sent the sister, old Mrs. Flint, to bed, as she will not be needed now," he said, leading Mrs. Varian into his patient's room. She needed his arm, for she trembled like a leaf in a gale. All her pride was trampled in the dust by the love of old days that rushed over her like a storm, laying waste all the barriers that anger and scorn had raised between her heart and the man lying there so deathly white and still, as if hovering death had already claimed him for his victim. Dr. Dean drew forward a large armchair to the side of the bed, placed Mrs. Varian in it, and abruptly withdrew, beckoning Janetta to follow. "You may wait outside the door while I go in to see another patient. I think the lady would prefer to be alone for a time," he said, for he also had his suspicions of something uncommon in the past of his two strange patients. He was right. Mrs. Varian was glad at last to be alone with Everard Dawn. She gazed with despairing eyes at his bandaged head, silent, pallid lips, and closed blue eyes. She bent her haughty head and pressed her fevered lips on the cold white hand that lay outside the cover, murmuring passionate words. "Oh, Everard, it is Pauline. Do you not know it is Pauline? Oh, do not die without one word to me, one word of love and pity, you who used to love me so. Is all the old love dead? Oh, you wronged me bitterly, Everard, but I cannot hate you any longer. The old love rises in me like an ice-bound stream released by the sunlight, and drowns me in its overflow. Oh, Everard, my loved and lost." Chapter 37. Beyond Forgiveness. Janetta, close outside the door, caught low, passionate murmurs from within in her mistress's voice, and guessed that she was pouring out her heart's wild grief in the insensate ears of the unconscious man. It was pitiful, and tears overflowed Janetta's eyes. For some time the low murmuring continued, then all grew still as death. She waited a while, then, fearful that her lady had fainted again, opened the door and went softly in. Everard Dawn lay still and silent, just faintly breathing, as before, and Mrs. Varian's dark head was bent down, resting upon the patient's hand. She motioned Janetta to her side, saying gently, "You may share my vigil, Janetta, and because I know this seems strange to you, I will confide in you. We loved each other very dearly once, this man and I, but a wicked woman came between us and wrecked my happiness. I tried to hate him, But now that he is dying, the old love rises in me again, and my heart is breaking." That was all, but she knew she was sure of the other woman's sympathy. Janetta might marvel at the utter breaking down of the proudest woman she had ever known, but she would love her better for her constancy and her womanly tenderness. So they kept their lonely vigils by the sufferer, who for 24 hours gave no sign of knowing aught, until they began to fear that he would pass into the other world without a sign or token to those left on earth. Mrs. Flint had been told that an old friend of her brother would help to nurse him, but when she saw that it was Mrs. Varian, she was filled with secret wonder that found expression in the words, "He never told me that he knew you, madam, but I do not see how he could have forgotten one like you." Mrs. Varian smiled with transient bitterness, but made no reply to the frank compliment, only showing her appreciation of it by simple, unaffected kindness to the grieving sister. The night and the day wore away, and in the early dusk of the December eve, Everard Dawn suddenly opened his eyes with full consciousness in them, and met the eager glance of large, dark, sorrowful orbs. "Oh, Everard, it is I, Paulina. Do you know me?" she murmured prayerfully. In a broken whisper he answered, "I know you." Then he closed his eyes again, and with a stifled sob Mrs. Varian sent Janetta to tell the doctor. He hastened to his side, delighted to find that his patient had rallied, but he whispered to the anxious watcher, "I do not dare bid you hope anything from this. The case is most uncertain." She bowed her head in silence, but from that moment not a movement of the invalid passed unwatched. He had recovered his consciousness, but the doctor saw in him as yet no certain chance of recovery. He was very still and quiet, speaking only when addressed, and lying always with half-closed eyes that seemed to notice nothing. At times they opened wider and followed Mrs. Varian's movements about the room, but he did not permit her to surprise that scrutiny. She was tender, but very timid, scarcely daring to offer the least attention, lest it be repulsed. There rang in her memory always some words he had uttered long ago. "Paulina, you have put upon me an unmerited disgrace and a cruel wrong. I will never forgive you as long as I live." Again, in the garden at Idlewild, 3 years ago, he had said to her most bitterly, "Do not think I have come to forgive you." She had never forgotten the bitterness of those words. They dazed her, too, for in her own opinion she had been the only wronged one, he the transgressor. He was going out of life now, and she read in his silence that he would keep his word, that for the grievance he cherished he would not grant forgiveness. Neither would he plead with her for pardon for the wrong that he had done. It was a cruel position for both, and she felt that he only endured her presence for cold pity's sake, while secretly wishing her away. "God help me, I cannot bear to leave him," she thought despairingly. The next morning, the travelers from Florida arrived. Cinthia and her aunt had a most affecting meeting, though it was the elder woman who broke down and forced the other to tears. "Oh, Cinthia, you never loved him as I did. You never knew him at his best before sorrow came to him and spoiled his nature," she sobbed. Cinthia could only weep. "It is not my fault that I was lacking in sympathy. I was never told of his troubles." "He did not wish for you to know, dear, lest your young life should be saddened more than it was already." "Dear aunt, I am very sorry for him, and grieved to see you looking so pale and thin. Tell me how all this came about," pleaded Cinthia, and while they are exchanging confidences, we will return to Arthur and his mother. She had gone to her room to receive him alone, and he clasped her tenderly in his arms. "Poor mother," he sighed, with deep compassion, and then they sat down and talked a while together. "I have one pleasant piece of news for you. Cinthia and Fred are engaged," he said. "I am glad of it, under the circumstances," she replied, exactly as he had replied to Frederick's announcement of the betrothal. She mused silently a moment, then added, "It will be good news for your father. He can die easier." You are sure that he must die, dear mother? You will not doubt it when you see him, Arthur, and the physician does not hold out any hope, though he thinks that the end may be lingering. She spoke with a steady calmness of despair, and her son looked at her with uneasy eyes, wondering how she felt, how she was bearing it. Perhaps she read his thoughts, for she said quickly, "Go to him as soon as you can, dear. Perhaps it may give him some pleasure to see you by him now. Be kind and tender, for the sake of old days." "And you, mother?" "I have done what I could, for duty's sake." Only for that? He wondered, but dared not ask, and soon left her to seek Mr. Don. Between the two there was a touching greeting, a strange one for two men who could only be supposed to harbor resentment against each other. Arthur was not ashamed to shed tears when he saw that helpless form and pallid face with the bandaged head. His voice trembled while he talked, and Mr. Don's replies were low and gentle. "I have kept very quiet. I have saved my strength till you and Cinthia came. I felt I would have much to bear then," he said feebly. Arthur answered hopefully, "I have good news for you. Cinthia has promised to marry my cousin Frederick Foster. Perhaps she might bear to know our secret now." "Perhaps so," he replied with a heavy sigh, and just then the door opened softly again, admitting Mrs. Flint with his daughter and Madame Ray. Arthur drew aside and returned to his mother, who was still alone, having sent Janetta to help with the wounded woman just across the hall, Rachel Dane. Mrs. Varian clung to her son, whispering wildly, "Tell me what brought her here, that beautiful Madame Ray. Is she aught to him?" "His daughter's friend, nothing more, dear mother." "Are you sure, quite sure? For Frederick hinted once that Cinthia wished them to marry, and she is so charming. Perhaps he loves her, Arthur?" Jealously. "No, mother. They are nothing but friends. Her heart is in the grave. Come, let me tell you her sad, touching story." He drew her to a seat and went over the sad details Madame Ray had given him in Florida, drawing bright tears from his mother's eyes. Then someone knocked on the door. It was Dr. Dean. "I have been with my patient, Mr. Don," he said, "and the coming of his daughter has greatly excited him, causing an improvement for the time, though how long it may last I cannot say. It seems as if there is something on his mind that he wishes to communicate before he dies, and he begs you and your son to join him at once with the others." Chapter 38. Her Side of the Story. Everard Don's haggard eyes marked the entrance of the doctor and the Varians, and he said feebly, "Are you all here, Cinthia, Arthur, his mother, my sister, and my kind friend Madame Ray?" "They are all here," Dr. Dean replied, and Everard Don continued, "I should like Mr. Foster to be present too, and Mrs. Varian's maid. She may need her ministrations in a trying scene. You too, Doctor. I would like to have stay if you can bear the disclosure of family secrets." The old doctor answered genially, "I have no wish to pry into family secrets, but it is best that I should stay, that I may render assistance should you overtax your feeble powers." They brought Frederick Foster and Janetta, and there were 8 of them forming a curious, anxious group about the bed. Across the hall, gasping for breath, and tossing restlessly from side to side in the pain of internal injuries, was a woman who would have taken as great an interest as any in the novel scene transpiring so close to her. But no one gave her a single thought. No one supposed that the humble servant, Rachel Dane, could have taken any interest in the event, much less have thrown a light on the dark mystery that had saddened several hopeful lives. Everything had been so closely guarded that little of it had come to her knowledge. Janetta had told her that Mr. Don's daughter and her friends had come. That was all. The suffering woman had a lively interest to see Cinthia, whom she had nursed as a little child, and of whom her aunt had talked so much, but she knew that her curiosity must bide the proper time. A housemaid had come in just now and said, "Janetta, you are wanted in Mr. Don's room. I will stay here until you come back." Janetta went as bidden, and stationed herself at the back of the armchair where her mistress was sitting, close to the bed. Then Everard Dawn exclaimed clearly, "Paulina!" Mrs. Varian gave a convulsive start and looked fearfully at the speaker. His blue eyes met hers with a commanding expression as he continued, "Paulina, in meeting my daughter here on my dying bed, she has demanded to know the details of the feud as she believes it, that shadowed so darkly the last 3 years of her young life. Once I would have died to shield her from such sorrow, but now she declares that certainty of sorrow is better than the pangs of suspense. She demands the truth. It is our bitter duty to yield to her desires." A hushed murmur of surprise went around the group, and Cinthia buried her face on Madame Ray's bosom. She had indeed pleaded with her father for the truth, and he had promised to gratify her wish, though she wondered why he added, "There was indeed a terrible reason why you could not marry Arthur, my dear child, and it would have killed you at first to know it. But now that you love another man and are engaged to marry him, you will not mind so much." They had startled her strangely, these words, and she hung tremblingly on every sentence that fell now from her father's lips. And before she hid her pallid face, she had seen Arthur draw his chair close to his mother's side, the mother he loved so dearly still, though she had parted him so cruelly from his beautiful betrothed. Again Everard Dawn breathed through pallid, pain-drawn lips, "All I ask of you, Paulina, is that you shall tell your side of our marriage and divorce. I will follow with my version of the story." The listeners could scarcely express outcries of surprise. Everard Dawn had revealed to them all in one brief sentence a totally unsuspected fact. Mrs. Varian, the wealthy, beautiful, haughty woman, was his divorced wife. Cinthia trembled with surprise and clung closer to her loving friend, who thought quickly, "My suspicions and forebodings are about to be verified. Alas, poor Cinthia!" Arthur Varian drew his arm about his mother, whispering to her of courage in this trying hour, begging her to gratify the sick man's request. Everard Dawn waited a moment, then added, "You may make the story as short as you please, only let it come from your own lips." Mrs. Varian lifted her head with something of her old haughty pride, and looked at Cinthia where she drooped against her friend's breast, but her voice was slightly tremulous as she began. "When I first met your father, Cinthia, he was a rising young lawyer employed by my father to attend to some complicated business matters. Our acquaintance ripened into love, and he became a suitor for my hand against my father's wishes. But as my love's only fault was poverty and we were rich, I soon persuaded Papa to withdraw his objections. So we were married." She paused and sighed, and everyone heard Everard Dawn re-echo that sigh heavily. "Go on, dear," whispered Arthur, encouragingly, with an anxious look at Cinthia. "We were very happy, for my husband seemed a model of manly perfection," continued Mrs. Varian. "We lived in Florida with my dear father, who made Everard the manager of all his investments, thus ensuring him independence of my fortune, for he was very proud and impatient of being thought a fortune hunter. Arthur was born when I had been married 1 year, and until he was 4 years old, I was the happiest woman on earth." Everard Dawn gave her a sudden bright look that she did not perceive, as if grateful for those words. Again sighing, she continued, "Then a dark shadow fell over Love's Retreat, the shadow of a beautiful young girl, the daughter of a former client of my husband. She arrived suddenly at our home one day bearing a letter from her father, who had recently died. In it he commended the girl, Gladys Lowe, to the guardianship of my husband, begging that he would keep her at his home till she married. To be brief, her father's property dwindled to nothing when it came to be settled up, leaving her penniless on our hands. A charge I would most generously have undertaken but for the predilection Miss Lowe immediately manifested for my husband, driving me wild with her kittenish coquetries, for she was very charming, with abundant tawny locks and effective hazel eyes that were always fixed on Everard with a passion she could not disguise. The Varians are charged with being jealous people, and I do not deny it. I feared she would win my husband with her blandishments, and I imperiously demanded of him that he send Miss Lowe away. Chapter 39. A Mortal Wound. Everyone in the room was listening with suppressed excitement to Mrs. Varian's story. Every eye was fixed on her mortally pale face, so deathlike in its pallor, save for the great dark eyes burning like coals of fire. Cinthia had grown ghastly too, as she rested in the clasp of Madame Ray's arm, taking no heed of her handsome betrothed on the other side, hovering near to console her in the terrible revelation soon coming. The lady paused, drew her breath in sharply, like one in pain, and resumed. I could not bring my husband to believe in the sincerity of my objections to his ward. He first laughed at my jealousy, then upbraided me with my injustice to a homeless orphan girl. He could not send her away penniless into the world, for he had been under obligations to her father, in whose office he had gained his first law practice. He begged me to have patience and charity toward Miss Lowe until her superior attraction should win her a husband. Heaven knows I was never lacking in Christian charity toward any unfortunate person, but Gladys Lowe was not a good girl. A flirt to her fingertips, and totally without principle or conscience. She discovered my jealousy and played on it cleverly, augmenting it by cunning schemes that my husband never suspected, and that I, in my bitter pride and jealousy, never betrayed to him. So matters went on for a year, and in that interval of time I several times surprised my husband in compromising situations with his ward. By my father's advice, I ordered her to leave my house, and there was a stormy scene. Miss Lowe threw shame to the winds. She refused to go and taunted me with having won my husband from me. I threatened to sue him for divorce, naming her as correspondent. She retorted that it was what they had both wished, in order that he might obtain his freedom to marry her. Without a word to my husband, for we had long been estranged through our differences over her, I left my home, taking my little son, and accompanied by my father, who fully sympathized with my grievances and despised the authors of my unhappiness. I then carried out my threat of suing my husband for divorce, implicating Miss Lowe. To cut the story short, my husband fought against the divorce, but his shameless ward helped it on by every art in her power, never denying the charges against her, and it was soon granted, giving me the custody of our son and the liberty to resume my maiden name. Mr. Don removed from Florida to Georgia, where Miss Lowe followed him, and within a few months he married her, thus proving his falsity to me. Her story was ended, and she leaned her head back against Arthur's shoulder, closing her eyes to shut out the sight of the surprised and pitying faces to whom she had just confessed the story of her life's humiliation. "Bravely done, dear mother," whispered Arthur, with a gentle kiss on her cold cheek. "It is my turn now," said Everard Dawn with a heavy sigh, and Dr. Dean rejoined, "I cannot permit you to talk very long, my dear patient." "It will not be difficult, sir, for Mrs. Varian has saved me the trouble of a long explanation. What she has related is perfectly true on the face of it, but behind the tragedy of our divorce lie the actual facts of the terrible mistakes of a jealous woman and a heedless man too secure of his great happiness to guard it close enough." A great thrill ran through the listeners as he continued. "I hold myself to blame that I was impatient of my wife's jealousy, and laughed at her fears that Miss Lowe was trying to win my heart. I pitied my ward for her orphanage and poverty, and I was too generous to believe that she was aught but a joyous-hearted girl whose little kittenish coquetries amounted to nothing. I was simply blind, besides being inordinately proud and passionately resentful of my wife's unjust suspicions. I loved her to idolatry, and her lack of faith angered me. I carried everything with too high a hand, perhaps, but I did not dream to what lengths the affair was going." Dr. Dean interposed gently. "You are exhausting your strength by too long a discourse." "Doctor, what difference can it make to a dying man whether his little stock of strength is exhausted sooner or later?" Wearily. "Go on, then, but be brief." "I found out too late," continued Everard Dawn. That Miss Lowe was different from what I thought. She had indeed conceived a mad love for me that had driven her to desperate lengths to win me. It is true that she followed me to Georgia, true that I married her, but only because of her passionate pleadings and assertions that through my wife's jealousy her character had been ruined. I gave her the shelter of my name, but, God forgive me, I hated her as long as she lived and could not help rejoicing when she was dead. I obtained a position as a commercial traveler so that I could spend most of my time away from her side, so her victory was a poor one after all, for she had wrecked 2 lives without gaining any happiness for herself. As for the rest, I affirm now on my deathbed and on my hopes of heaven that Gladys Lowe and I were as innocent of wrongdoing before my divorce as the purest angel. She was wicked enough to make my wife believe it, through her jealousy so easily imposed on, but she was not guilty, so help me heaven." He paused, and there rose a stifled cry of bitter anguish. It came from Cynthia's ghastly lips as the cruel truth began to dawn on her bewildered brain. Everard Dawn looked at her pityingly and said, "Ah, Cinthia, you understand it all now. She was your mother. Perhaps you will not blame me now that I failed in love to you, that I forgot my duty to you in resentment at what you represented. The wicked love of a woman who wrecked my life in parting me from all that made it dear." A low moan came from her blanched lips, and Arthur Varian left his mother's side and approached her with leaden-weighted feet, and a look as of death's agony in his fixed blue eyes. He took her hand and said, hollowly, "Cinthia, you understand it all now, but you will not mind it, I know, because Fred is going to make you very happy, my dear little sister." No one in that room ever forgot the white agony of Cynthia Dawn's face as she sprung to her feet with outstretched arms, quivering all over as if a bullet had pierced her heart, pushing Arthur away as if his hand had given the mortal wound. "Oh, God, let me die!" she shrieked in her despair, and sunk senseless in Madame Ray's arms. Chapter 40. A Late Repentance. Dr. Dean feared that all that excitement must hurt his patient very much, so he cleared the room as soon as possible, letting no one stay but Mrs. Flint and himself. She, poor old lady, was terribly shocked at hearing the full story of her brother's life, having only known a few hazy details before. But she pulled herself together the best she could and hung tenderly over the bedside, chafing her brother's cold hands and murmuring, "Poor Everard, how cruelly you have been wronged, and how sad your life has been. If I had known all the truth, I could never have blamed you for neglecting Cynthia, though it is a pity, for a sweeter girl never lived, I am sure. She cannot have inherited her disposition from her wicked mother." He looked at her kindly, but he was too exhausted by all he had endured to answer, but lay pale and gasping among the pillows, while the doctor busied himself with restoratives. "All this excitement has been very bad for him, and he must have quiet and sleep the rest of the day," he said uneasily, before he went out to see after his other patients. They had carried Cynthia to her own room, where Madame Ray hung over her with tearful devotion, excluding everyone else, even her anxious betrothed, who hung about in most disconsolate fashion. Janetta returned to her watch by Rachel Dane, and Arthur accompanied his mother to her own apartments, mastering his own agitation in his tenderness for her trouble. "You will lie down and rest, dear mother, or you will be ill after this fatiguing ordeal," he pleaded. She was pacing restlessly up and down the floor, a picture of nervous suffering painful to gaze upon. Pausing in the center of the room, her white, jeweled fingers locked together as if in pain, she looked at him with burning eyes, crying wildly, "Oh, Arthur, how can I rest? How can I sleep? He is dying, and I am full of doubt and terror. Awakened conscience daunts me. Have I wronged him or not? Is he innocent or is he guilty?" "Mother, you heard him swear to his innocence by all his hopes of heaven." "He swore to it before, Arthur, on the day when I sued him for divorce. He came to me swearing his innocence, pleading for mercy. I turned from him in anger, refusing to believe him, scorning all his prayers. How could you be so hard, mother? I was mad with wounded love and jealousy. I had let that fiendish girl destroy, with cunning arts, all my faith in him. Besides, my father was against him. He feared he had married me for my wealth alone. Poor mother, how you were tortured. No wonder you made such a fatal mistake. Arthur, Arthur! Her voice rang out wildly. You believe that it was a mistake? He came up to her, put his hands on her shoulders, and looked at her earnestly, tenderly. Mother, must I tell you frankly what I believe, what I have believed in my soul ever since my first interview with my father that day in Washington? Yes, speak the whole truth, though it crushes me, sighed the unhappy woman, and he answered, I do not mean to be cruel to you, dear mother. I pity you, and I understand your terrible provocation for all you did. But I believe in my father's innocence and his perfect nobility. He told me his full story in Washington, and I have believed in him, loved him, revered him ever since, and his death will be a blow to me only second to your own. Then, Arthur, I am a miserable sinner. I have wrecked his life, contritely. Then you must acknowledge your fault and beg his forgiveness. He has sworn that he will never forgive me as long as I live. Oh, my heart, what a cruel wretch I have been to him, and I loved him so. I do not merit his forgiveness. But he shall grant it, mother. I will add my prayers to yours. Oh, Arthur, shall we go to him now, my poor wronged love? Weeping. Not now, dear mother, because he is exhausted and needs rest. We must wait. Oh, if he could know my shame and repentance, and how I have loved him always in spite of myself. Might it not comfort him, Arthur? I will find out when he can see you and tell you himself, mother, if you will be very patient, and let him rest a while first, mother. I will wait as long as you wish me, Arthur, my poor boy, for I need your forgiveness too. I have wronged you also, depriving you these long and weary years of a father's love. Besides, there was all your bitter trouble over Cinthia, but thank heaven it is all over now, that sorrow. Yes, it is all over now, he said calmly, but with white lips. And then he went away to his father's room, where Mrs. Flint was sitting alone, wishing he were not so restless, fearing it was a bad sign. Arthur bent over him caressingly and whispered, My poor mother, after years of sorrow, divided between doubt and anger, is at last convinced of your innocence, and her poor heart is breaking with remorse for her sin and love that she could never conquer. He saw a strange gleam in the deep blue eyes, and the pale lips twitched with emotion. He continued, almost pleadingly, Her pride is humbled in the dust, and her dearest wish is to express her penitence and pray for forgiveness. Her sin was great, but, dear father, you have a noble heart. Is it shut against her forever? What a light came over the pallid face, what strange new fire to the dim eyes, what deep emotion quivered in the voice that answered, When your mother first entered into my heart, Arthur, she locked the door and threw away the key forever. How could I bar her out after a lifelong possession? Oh, father, what a constant heart! Yet she fears that you can never forgive her. In the passion of wounded love and anger I swore that I would not, Arthur. But that was long ago, and in the face of death, how puerile these worldly resentments seem. Then, too, I believed she had wearied of me, believed me a fortune hunter. Her wealth and her pride raised a wall between us. I could not dream that lips like hers could ever stoop to the word forgive. Would you like to hear her say it now, my father? No, Arthur, for it is needless. If she could come to me with another word, the dear word love, it would pay for all. How sweet to die with her hand in mine, her lips on my brow. Ah, what a love was here! So patient under cruel wrong, so faithful, so forgiving. Arthur's nature bowed in reverence to its holiness. "She will come when you wish," he said gently. "Let it be now, Arthur." "But Dr. Dean said," began his sister uneasily. "I cannot permit anyone to dictate in this. Every moment of suspense counts against my life," the patient answered firmly, and Arthur went. It was but a little while before he returned with a drooping figure on his arm. Mrs. Flint safely withdrew to a window, with her back to the bed. Arthur led his mother to the bedside and placed her in a chair. Then he took her cold and trembling hand and placed it in that of his father. She thrilled with a passion of joy at the feeble pressure, and bent forward, pressing her quivering lips to his pale brow, whispering in a tempest of restrained emotion. "Oh, Everard, I wronged you, but I never ceased to love you." And there was deep silence and rare happiness, even though the shadow of death hovered over the room, and presently she whispered entreatingly, "Oh, Everard, do not die and leave me now. I cannot let you go again. I will nurse you and tend you so faithfully that surely heaven will give you back to me, and some day, when I have somewhat atoned by penitence and devotion, perhaps you will let me be your wife again." "Ah, Paulina, if it might be now, for the doctor does not hold out any hope of life. But at least I should die happy, knowing you were mine again." "You shall have your wish," cried Arthur, hastening from the room. Then Everard Dawn called his sister to make friends with Paulina. "I should like for you to love each other when I am gone," he said gently. "Oh, brother, we cannot let you go now, when happiness has come to you again. I am praying for you every moment," cried the kind old lady, clasping hands with the beautiful woman whom she would be proud to call sister. Chapter 41. The Greed of Gold. Meanwhile, Janetta, watching by the bedside of Rachel Dane, did not like the looks of her patient. The woman had been very bad from the first, her body covered with bruises, and complaining of severe inward pains that indicated internal injuries. All that medical skill could do, combined with careful nursing, had been lavished on the sufferer, but it was quite evident that her days were numbered. Today she was restless and querulous, sliding down in bed and picking at the covers in an ominous way. "Where is my mistress?" she inquired presently, adding in a fretful tone, "She has entirely neglected me today." Janetta soothingly made excuses for Mrs. Flint, saying that her niece had arrived that morning, and they had been together in the room of Mr. Dawn, who was not expected to live long. "I should like to see Miss Dawn," Rachel muttered curiously. "That would be impossible, for the young lady was quite prostrated by the excitement in her father's room, and was carried to bed just now with a doctor in attendance," replied Janetta. Rachel Dane kept silence quite a little while. Then she sharply ordered Janetta to go away and send Mrs. Flint. The maid obeyed, only too glad to get away from the gruesome company of the dying woman. Mrs. Flint came at once, wan and weary from excitement, but full of kindly sympathy. "Rachel, I am sorry to see that you are not so well today," she said. "So you can see it? Well, I felt it myself. That's why I wanted you. I knew you would tell me the truth. Am I going to die?" Querulously. Mrs. Flint had been by many a deathbed, and she saw the signs here, so she answered frankly. "Rachel, I don't want to frighten you, but it's time you should make your peace with God." The poor wretch shuddered and moaned. "Are you sure? Did the doctor say so, ma'am?" "He has never had any hope of your recovery, Rachel, and you are failing fast today. You will soon be done with this world, but alas, you are not ready for the next one." She did not want to frighten the parting soul, but she was sorrowful over the life going out into eternal darkness. Rachel Dane shuddered and cried, I always meant to get ready when the time came, but it caught me unprepared. I'm only 50-odd years old, and I hope to live to 90. Oh, tell me what to do. Help me. Pray for me." "I've prayed for you, Rachel Dane, ever since you made your home under my roof, and I'm glad your heart is softened at last. Try to love God and believe in His goodness. Say after me, 'Lord, forgive a dying sinner, and save me for Christ's sake. Amen.'" The dying creature clutched at the bedclothes and mumbled the words in pitiful earnest, after which Mrs. Flint knelt by the bed and herself offered up a fervent prayer. "Oh, I've been bad and wicked all my life, hating God because I was poor. I don't know how to get His favor now," sighed the dying sinner, and Mrs. Flint answered soothingly, "If you have done anything wicked that you can undo, now is the time to repent and get God's forgiveness." She saw a look of alarm come into the fading eyes, and Rachel plucked wildly at the counterpane, muttering, "I did a cruel wrong 20 years ago. I stole the baby daughter of a heartbroken young widow." "Good heavens! How dreadful! Tell me all about it quickly, and perhaps something may yet be done to right the wrong," cried Mrs. Flint in dismay. But at that moment they were interrupted by the opening of the door, and Madame Ray glided in, murmuring in her sweet, soft voice, "They told me you were watching by a very sick woman, and as Cinthia is asleep, I thought I might be of some assistance to you." She had never heard the name of Rachel Dane, and she came and stood by the bed, looking down with pity and sympathy at the poor soul. Rachel Dane turned her heavy eyes upward to the lovely face, and then uttered a cry of deadly fear. "My God! It is Mrs. Ray, come to haunt me in my dying hour." "Rachel Dane, where is my child, my baby daughter?" cried the other wildly, and shaking with excitement, she added, "Do not die, miserable wretch, till you reveal the truth." Mrs. Flint stared in wonder and exclaimed, "The poor woman was just confessing to me that she had stolen a young widow's child 20 years ago. Go on with your story, Rachel." She pushed the agitated lady into a chair as she spoke, and waited with eager curiosity and sympathy for the next words. Rachel looked fearfully at the woman she had wronged and muttered, "Do not look so wretched, lady, for all is well with your daughter, and she shall be restored to your arms." "Thank God! Thank God!" cried the mother with a rush of glad tears. "So it was Madame Ray's child that you stole, Rachel? But why did you do such a wicked thing?" cried her mistress. "Oh, Mrs. Flint, it was for the greed of gold that has always cursed my life, the longing for gold and pleasure. A beautiful woman came to me and said, 'I have been married 2 years and I have no child. My husband will never love me till I give him an heir. I would like a little girl because his first wife had a boy, and I hate it. Find me a pretty baby and help me to impose it on him as my own when he returns from his long journey, and you shall live with me, and I will make you rich.' Wretch that I was, I stole Mrs. Ray's sweet baby, and helped the other woman to fool her husband. She paid me well, but growing weary of my extortions after 2 years, she and her husband stole away north, where I could never trace them, till one night I saw him on the train and followed him, only to find that his wife had died years before." "But my child, my darling, where is she?" sobbed the eager mother. "Where is the child?" echoed Mrs. Flint suspiciously, and Rachel Dane answered gladly, "Oh, how glad I am to restore her safe to her mother's arms. She is here with you, Mrs. Flint, the girl called Cinthia Dawn, but no kin of yours, for she is the baby I stole for Mrs. Dawn, the unloved wife, the child of Mrs. Richard Ray, and may heaven forgive my sin." Chapter 42. In the Sunshine. He laughed a laugh of merry scorn, he turned and kissed her where she stood. "If you are not the heiress born, and I," said he, "the next in blood." "If you are not the heiress born, and I," said he, "the lawful heir, we two will wed to-morrow morn, and you shall still be Lady Clare." When Arthur Varian Dawn left his father's room so hastily that day, it was with the firm determination to see his parents married again before the set of sun, if it could possibly be accomplished, without injury to his father's poor hold on life. He had a brief talk with Dr. Dean, who agreed with him that the consummation of so joyful an event ought to do good to the patient, giving him new hold on life, if such a thing were possible in his precarious state. "I do not wish to deceive you," he said with professional frankness. "The case is serious. I am not frightened at the scalp wound, because it is doing nicely, and the compound fracture of the leg below the knee might get well in 6 weeks if the patient will lie in bed all the time. But there are symptoms of internal injuries that make me uneasy. If I am mistaken about that, he may pull through." "God grant it!" cried Arthur fervently. "And as you say," continued the doctor, "whether he lives or dies, it will be a comfort to him to marry his divorced wife over again, so I will go with you to get the license and the preacher." So, together with Frederick Foster, they went to arrange the necessary details, and in their absence there occurred that scene by the deathbed of Rachel Dane that was to make such a change in the destinies of Arthur and Cinthia, the sorely tried lovers. When they returned several hours later with the minister, Mrs. Flint was informed of what was about to occur, and begged her new-found nephew to let her have the services of the man of God first, for a dying sinner. "Poor Rachel Dane is going fast, and she is afraid to die, poor soul. We must try to hold a light for her feet, as she goes groping down into the dark valley," she said pitifully. "Has her life been so wicked?" he asked wonderingly, and the old lady answered, "She has lived without God, and her sins are many. She made a most interesting confession a while ago, and I would like for you to go and hear it, dear nephew, from Madame Ray, while the minister is engaged with Rachel." Mrs. Flint spoke with such a glad and cheerful smile that he was quite puzzled. He was sorry for the dying woman, but not much interested in her sins and confessions. His thoughts were hovering around Cinthia. She had been carried unconscious from Mr. Don's room, and only revived to go into such hysterical spasms that they almost feared for her life. It was thought best to quiet her by strong opiates, and she had been sleeping heavily now for hours. Poor Cinthia! They had thought the truth would not shock her now, because she was betrothed to another, but they had been terribly mistaken. The hopeless love that had tortured her heart with secret pain threatened to end in death or madness, now that they had told her that Arthur was her brother. With an aching heart, the young man turned his steps to her door to ask Madame Ray how the hapless girl fared. Meanwhile, the lady had hurried from Rachel's deathbed back to Cynthia's room. Kneeling down, she pressed joyful kisses on the sleeping face, so pale and woeful even in slumber, so that it was easy to guess at last the guarded secret of that young heart, the love that had never strayed from its object through the long and hopeless years. Softly, tenderly, the happy mother drew aside the soft folds of lace and lines, searching until she found just above the heart a remembered birthmark, a tiny crimson cross. "The birthmark of the Rays! Oh, how well I remember this! Oh, my darling, my own, you are indeed my lost treasure. No wonder that I have always loved you so. It was the mother heart that claimed you," she cried gladly, longing for Cinthia to awake and learn the happy truth that she was her own daughter, and not at all related to Arthur, whom she might marry when she would, only for the rash promise given to Fred Foster in a moment of reckless pride. Poor fellow! This will be sad news for him, but I believe that he will be generous to dear Cinthia, she concluded, and sat down to watch the sleeper with the glad eyes of love. It was a while later that she heard a timid rap at the door, and found Arthur waiting outside with a grave, sad face, though he said cheerfully, "I have come to invite you and Cinthia to a wedding." "A wedding?" In a few words he told her of the reconciliation between his father and mother, and the impending marriage. She congratulated him warmly and said meaningly, "I will be glad to be present at the ceremony, but my daughter is asleep." Arthur started wildly and echoed, "Your daughter?" "Yes, Arthur," and she drew him gently into the room. Come and look at her, how pale and ill she lies, almost stricken to death by the thought that she was your sister. Oh, I have such happy news for you both, Arthur." "She is stirring! She is waking!" he exclaimed eagerly, and indeed at that moment the girl opened wide her large dark eyes with a dazed look. Madame Ray, all joyful excitement, covered her daughter's face with kisses, exclaiming, "Oh, Cinthia! Oh, Arthur! Such joyful news! I have found out that you are my lost daughter, my darling! You know, Arthur, you always declared we resembled each other. Well, the nurse stole her from me to sell her to your father's second wife, for she deceived her husband, the wicked woman. She never had a child of her own. That dying woman in yonder, Rachel Dane, has confessed everything. You and Cinthia are not brother and sister at all, but lovers as in past days. Kiss her, Arthur, if you wish, and be happy again." He bent down to obey, but drew back again with a cry of grief. "I cannot. She is promised to my cousin." "He will give her back her freedom when he learns the truth, for he has a noble nature," cried Madame Ray, and the event proved that she was right. Fred Foster's heart was very sad already, for Cynthia's grief had shown him, but a while ago, that he could never hope to win her heart. So when he heard the wonderful news, and saw the new joy on Cynthia's lovely face, he said generously, "Cinthia, I have long known of your past love affair with Arthur, and since things have fallen out so happily for you, I will restore you the troth plight so lately given, and trust to time to heal my heart wound. Tomorrow is Christmas, you know, and I shall present you as a precious gift to Arthur." Oh, how thankful they were for his generosity, and how glad that another love cured his heart in a year, though they were touched when they saw that she resembled Cinthia in her type, dark eyes and golden hair. It showed them plainly how deep had been his love. Cinthia was well again almost in a minute, in her new joy, and anxious to witness the second marriage ceremony between Arthur's parents. So presently the same group of the morning gathered in the room, and the grave minister who had just closed the eyes of Rachel Dane, after teaching her soul to find rest in God, joined the hands of Everard Dawn and his Paulina for the journey of life, while he solemnly invoked God's blessing on them all. Everard Dawn could not die now. Life had grown too sweet again. Events proved that the physician's fear of internal injuries was unfounded. He began to convalesce slowly but surely under his wife's love and care, looking forward to happy years together in the golden future. Rachel Dane was buried at Charlottesville, and as she had no known relatives anywhere, Mrs. Flint was the chief mourner at the funeral, and she took care to have a neat stone raised above the grave. In a few days the party at the hotel separated, Everard Dawn's wife and son remaining with him to aid in the tedious convalescence, and Madame Ray returning to Florida with her daughter, taking the ailing Mrs. Flint as their guest. "I am real down sorry to lose you as a niece, Cynthia," sighed the old lady, who was greatly softened now by the hurrying events. "Do not grieve over that, dear aunt, for I will restore the kinship in the spring, and in the meantime you have gained me as a nephew," laughed Arthur, who was handsome as a picture in his new happiness. "That is true, and I am real down proud of my new nephew, and his mother, too," cried the old lady. Arthur's mother had taken the first opportunity to make her peace with Cinthia. "Dearest, I was cruel to you once, but I am a changed woman now, and I love you dearly since I know that you never belonged to that woman I hated so. Can you forgive me, if not for my own sake, because you will be Arthur's wife?" Cinthia, understanding everything now, gladly recorded forgiveness and sympathy that soon ripened into love. In the spring, when Mr. Dawn was well and strong again, his son was married to Cinthia at her mother's home, Lodge Delight. It was a grand wedding, and Cinthia the fairest bride ever seen. They remained with Madame Ray until Love's Retreat was rebuilt, then made their home with his parents, while Mrs. Flint remained ever afterward with Cynthia's mother, who would not permit her return to Virginia. "We are two lonely old widows. Let us be company for each other," she said with pensive cheerfulness. One thing that transpired touched Cinthia very much, and showed her the tenderness of Arthur's love. Madame Ray said to Mr. Dawn, while he still lay on his bed of suffering. "That fortune Cinthia has been enjoying as your daughter, Mr. Don, must be restored to you now, as she never had any legal right to it." Mr. Don looked embarrassed for a moment, then frankly explained. "On the day that Arthur found out that Cinthia was supposedly his sister, he insisted on making over to her use enough of his private fortune to ensure her the luxuries of life in lieu of happiness. And it will now form part of her marriage settlement," added Arthur. Tears sprung to Cynthia's eyes as she murmured, "Oh, how noble and generous you have been all these years, while I thought you so weak and cowardly, and tried in vain to hate you. But all the while—" Arthur drew her to his heart and finished the sentence for her, very low and tenderly. "All the while, I loved you better than you knew." The end.